6. The transformation of philosophy. With your permission, I should like to offer some reflections on Marxist philosophy. We live in a historical period in which the fact that Marxism, Marxist theory and Marxist philosophy forms part of our culture does not mean that it is integrated into it. On the contrary, Marxism functions in our culture as an element and force of division. That Marxism is an object of conflict, a doctrine defended by some and violently attacked and deformed by others, should surprise no one. Because Marxism, its theory and its philosophy, tables the question of class struggle. And we know full well that behind the theoretical options opened up by Marxism there reverberates the reality of political options and a political struggle. Nevertheless, despite its great interest, I shall leave aside this aspect of the question and focus on the paradoxical characteristics of Marxist philosophy. Marxist philosophy presents an internal paradox that is initially bewildering, and whose elucidation turns out to be enigmatic. This paradox can be stated simply by saying, Marxist philosophy exists, yet has never been produced as philosophy. What does this mean? All the philosophies with which we are familiar, from Plato to Husserl, Wittgenstein and Heidegger, have been produced as philosophies and have themselves furnished the proofs of their philosophical existence by means of rational theoretical systems that generate discourses, treatises, and other systematic writings which can be isolated and identified as philosophy in the history of culture. This is not all. Such systematic and rational theoretical systems have always furnished the proof of their philosophical existence by means of the knowledge, or the discovery, of an object of their own, whether that object is the idea of the whole, of being, of truth, of the a priori conditions of any knowledge or possible action, of origin, of meaning, or of the being of being. All known philosophies, then, have presented themselves in the history of our culture as philosophies, within the field of the history of philosophy, in the form of discourses, treatises, or rational systems that convey the knowledge of an object of their own. But we must go further. In constituting themselves as philosophies within the field of culture, all known philosophies have carefully differentiated themselves from other discursive forms or other bodies of written work. When Plato writes his dialogues or his didactic works, he takes great care to differentiate them from any other literary, rhetorical or sophistic discourse. When Descartes or Spinoza writes, no one can mistake it for literature. When Kant or Hegel writes, we are not dealing with a moral exhortation, a religious sermon, or a novel. Thus philosophy produces itself by radically distinguishing itself from moral, political, religious or literary genres. But what is most important is that philosophy produces itself, as philosophy, by distinguishing itself from the sciences. Here one of the most crucial aspects of the question arises. It seems as if the fate of philosophy is profoundly linked to the existence of the sciences, since the existence of a science is required to induce the emergence of philosophy, as in Greece, when geometry induces Platonic philosophy. And this bond within a common destiny is all the more profound inasmuch as philosophy cannot arise without the guaranteed existence of the rational discourse of a pure science, the case of geometry vis-à-vis Plato, analytic geometry and physics vis-à-vis Descartes, Newtonian physics vis-à-vis Kant, etc. Philosophy can exist, and be distinct from myth, religion, moral or political exhortation, and the aesthetic, only on the absolute precondition of being itself able to offer a pure rational discourse, that is, a rational discourse whose model philosophy can find only in the rigorous discourse of existing sciences. But at this point things undergo a surprising inversion. Philosophy borrows the model of its own pure rational discourse from existing pure sciences. Think of the tradition that runs from "let no one enter philosophy who is not a geometer," to Spinoza's injunction to heed geometry, to Husserl's philosophy as a rigorous science. Yet this very same philosophy completely inverts in philosophy its relationship with the sciences. That is, philosophy separates itself rigorously from the real sciences and their objects and declares that it is a science, not in the sense of the vulgar sciences, which know not what they speak of, but rather in the sense of the supreme science, the science of sciences, the science of the a priori conditions of any science, the science of the dialectical logic that converts all real sciences into mere determinations of the intellect, etc. In other words, philosophy borrows the model for its pure rational discourse from the existing sciences. Thus it is subjected to the real sciences, which are its condition of possibility. Yet within its own discourse, an inversion occurs. Philosophical discourse transforms its act of submission to the sciences and situates itself, as philosophy, above the sciences, assuming power over them. Thus it is that in Plato mathematics is relegated to the subordinate order of the Dhyana, the hypothetical disciplines, subjected to the anhypothetical disciplines which are the object of philosophy. So it is that in Descartes the sciences are only branches growing from the trunk of metaphysics. So it is that in Kant, Hegel and Husserl philosophy is what has the last word as regards the sciences, that is, it pronounces on their validity, their meaning in the dialectic of pure logic, their meaning in relation to their origin in the concrete transcendental subject. The singular and highly contradictory bond uniting philosophy with the sciences, this operation that transforms philosophy's conditions of existence, and hence those of the sciences, into determinations subordinated to philosophy itself, and through which philosophy, declaring that it alone possesses their truth, installs itself in power over the sciences, which supply the model of its own rational and systematic discourse. This forms part of the production of philosophy as philosophy. And it leads us to suspect that between the first demarcation we have indicated, via which philosophy distinguishes itself from myth and religion, from moral exhortation and political eloquence, or from poetry and literature, and the second, to which we have just alluded, which concerns the sciences, there exists a profound bond. For if we examine the question closely, we shall come to realize that philosophy is satisfied neither with dominating the sciences nor with speaking the truth of the sciences. Philosophy equally imposes its dominion over religion and morality, politics and aesthetics, and even economics, beginning with Plato, in whom we find a surprising theory of wages, and Aristotle, with his appraisals of value and the slave system. Philosophy thus appears as the science of the whole, that is to say, of all things. Philosophy enunciates the truth of all external objects, reveals what such objects are incapable of articulating by themselves, it speaks, it reveals, their essence. And we may legitimately infer that the formula used with respect to sciences, "let no one enter philosophy who is not a geometer," equally applies to other subjects. In order to speak of religion the philosopher should be moral, in order to speak of politics the philosopher should be a politician, In order to speak of art, the philosopher should be an aesthetician, etc. The same type of inversion that we have seen at work on the terrain of the sciences is likewise operative, only mutely, with respect to all other objects which, in a particular way, inhabit the space of philosophy. Except that philosophy allows them to accede to it only on condition that it has previously imposed its dominion over them. In a few words, the production of philosophy as philosophy concerns all human ideas and all human practices, but always subordinating them to philosophy, that is to say, subjecting them to a radical philosophical form. And it is this process of the subordination of human practices and ideas to philosophical form which we see realized in philosophical dialogues, treatises and systems. It might seem rather simplistic to put the question like this: why does philosophy need to exist as a distinct thing? Why does it need to speak with the utmost care to distinguish itself from the sciences and from every other idea or social practice? Why, philosophy speaks only of them. Let us say that the question is not so simple. That philosophy feels the need to speak, or rather, assumes the responsibility of speaking and consigning what it has to say to separate, identifiable treatises, derives from the fact that, in its profound historical conviction, it considers it has an irreplaceable task to accomplish. This is to speak the truth about all human practices and ideas. Philosophy believes that no one and nothing can speak in its name, and that if it did not exist, the world would be bereft of its truth. Because for the world to exist, it is necessary for such truth to be spoken. This truth is logos, or origin, or meaning. And since there are common origins between logos and speech, between logos and logine, truth and discourse, or, put another way, since the specific, stubborn existence of logos is not materiality or practice or any other form, but speech, voice, word, there is only one means of knowing logos, and hence truth, the form of discourse. This intimacy between logos and speech means that truth, logos, can be entirely enclosed or captured and offered up only in the discourse of philosophy. For this reason philosophy can in no way transcend its own discourse. Accordingly, it is clear that its discourse is not a medium, or an intermediary between it and truth, but the very presence of truth as logos. But now the strange paradox of Marxist philosophy is upon us. Marxist philosophy exists, yet it has not been produced as philosophy in the sense we have just analyzed. We do not need to go very far to be convinced of this. Apart from the brief sentences, brilliant and enigmatic, of the theses on Feuerbach, which announced a philosophy that never arrived. Apart from the scathing philosophical critiques in the Germany ideology directed against the neo-Hegelians, who limited themselves to plunging all philosophy into the misty nothingness of ideology. And apart from the celebrated allusions to Hegel in the postface to the second German edition of Capital, Marx left us no philosophical treatise or discourse. Twice, in 2 letters, he promised a score or so pages on the dialectic, but they never materialized. We may assume that they were scarcely easy to write. No doubt Engels left us his philosophical critique of Dühring, and Lenin his materialism and empirio-criticism, another critique. Many elements can doubtless be drawn from a critique, but how is it to be thought? How are we to structure it theoretically? Are we dealing with the elements of a whole, albeit an absent whole, without effective presence, elements which it would suffice to re-elaborate according to traditional models, as in the case of Marxist philosophies that remain immersed in ontology? Or, on the contrary, is it a question of elements which must be interrogated and deciphered, asked precisely why they remain only, and uniquely, elements? Of course, we also possess Lenin's notebooks on Hegel. But the same questions arise here too. What meaning can be given to simple reading notes, to these brilliant but enigmatic pointers? In short, we are forced to conclude in every instance that Marx, and even Engels and Lenin, left us nothing even remotely comparable to the classical forms of philosophical discourse. Now, the extent of this paradox still lies ahead of us. It resides in the fact that the absence of a philosophical discourse within Marxism has nevertheless produced prodigious philosophical effects. No one can deny that the philosophy we have inherited, the great classical philosophical tradition, from Plato to Descartes, from Kant to Hegel and Husserl, has been shaken in its very foundations, and in all its pretensions, by the impact of that ungraspable, almost formless encounter suddenly produced by Marx. Yet it never presented itself in the direct form of a philosophical discourse, but quite the reverse, in the form of a text like Capital. In other words, not a philosophical text but a text in which the capitalist mode of production, and, through it, the structures of social formations, is investigated. A text, ultimately, which deals only with a scientific knowledge linked to the class struggle, a scientific knowledge which thus offers itself to us as simultaneously part of the proletarian class struggle, that is the very thing represented in Capital. So, how do we grasp such a paradox? I would like to resolve this paradox by taking the shortest route, even if it is not exactly that of actual history. Hence, I would say at the outset that for all their brevity and incompletion, the theses on Feuerbach contain the sketch of a cardinal suggestion. When Marx writes in Thesis I, the chief defect of all hitherto existing materialism, that of Feuerbach included, is that the thing, reality, sensuousness, is conceived only in the form of the object, or of contemplation, but not as sensuous human activity, practice, not subjectively, to the first he know. Doubt employs formulae that can be interpreted in the sense of a transcendental philosophy of practice. And some have persisted in resorting to this active subjectivity, conceiving it as legitimizing a humanist philosophy, while Marx is referring to something different, since he expressly declares it to be critical and revolutionary. But in this enigmatic sentence, in which practice is specifically opposed to the object form and the contemplation form, Marx has not introduced any philosophical notion on a par with the object form and the contemplation form, and hence destined to replace them in order to establish a new philosophy, to inaugurate a new philosophical discourse. Instead, he establishes a reality that possesses the particularity of being at one and the same time presupposed by all traditional philosophical discourses, yet naturally excluded from such discourses. What I am saying here is inferred not only from the thesis on Feuerbach but also from all Marx's work, from Capital and the writings that deal with the class struggle of the workers' movement. This eruption of practice into the philosophical tradition, even the materialist philosophical tradition, given that 18th-century materialism was not a materialism of practice, constitutes at base a radical critique of that classical form of the existence of philosophy which I have defined as the production of philosophy as philosophy, what in fact are the object form and the contemplation form. Now in the guise of the metaphor of vision, a metaphor interchangeable with the metaphor of presence or that of the speech of the Logos, they are the very condemnation of the claim of any philosophy to maintain the relation of discursive presence with its object. A moment ago I suggested that the peculiarity of the philosophical conception of the truth is its inability to exist in any other form than that of the object, or of contemplation. In both cases we confront the same privilege, the same claim. For philosophy men live and act subjected to the laws of their own social practices. They know not what they do. They believe they possess truths. They are not aware of what they know. Thank God philosophy is there, that it sees for them and speaks for them, tells them what they do and what they know. Well now, the eruption of practice is a denunciation of philosophy produced as this kind of philosophy. That is to say, it opposes philosophy's claim to embrace the ensemble of social practices and ideas, to see the whole, as Plato said, in order to establish its dominion over these same practices. It is counter to philosophy that Marxism insists that philosophy has an exterior or, better expressed, that philosophy exists only through and for this exterior. This exterior, which philosophy wishes to imagine it submits to truth, is practice, the social practices. The radicalism of this critique must be acknowledged if its consequences are to be understood. In contrast to the Logos, that is, to a representation of something supreme, to what is called truth, whose essence is reducible to speech whether in the immediate presence of sight or voice, practice, which is utterly foreign to the Logos, is not truth and is irreducible to, does not realize itself in, speech or sight. Practice is a process of transformation which is always subject to its own conditions of existence and produces, not the truth, but rather truths, or the truth, let us say, of results or of knowledge, all within the field of its own conditions of existence. And if practice has agents, it nevertheless does not have a subject as the transcendental or ontological origin of its objective, its project. Nor does it have a goal as the truth of its process. It is a process without subject or goal. Squared if we take the term truth in its philosophical sense, from Plato to Hegel, and if we confront it with practice, a process without subject or goal, according to Marx, it must be affirmed that there is no truth of practice. Accordingly, there is a problem involved in assigning practice the role of truth, of foundation, of origin, in a new philosophy that would be a philosophy of praxis. If I cite this expression, it is not against Gramsci, who never envisaged this. Practice is not a substitute for truth for the purposes of an immutable philosophy. On the contrary, it is what knocks philosophy off balance. Whether in the case of errant matter or the class struggle, practice is what philosophy, throughout its history, has never been able to incorporate. Practice is that other thing, on the basis of which it is possible not only to knock philosophy off balance, but also to begin to see clearly into the interior of philosophy. I suggested earlier that practice compels philosophy to recognize that it has an exterior. Maybe philosophy has not introduced into the domain of its thought the totality of what exists, including mud, of which Socrates spoke, or the slave, of which Aristotle spoke, or even the accumulation of riches at one pole and of misery at the other, of which Hegel spoke. For Plato, philosophy observes the whole. For Hegel, philosophy thinks the whole. In fact, all the social practices are there in philosophy, not just money, wages, politics and the family, but all social ideas, morality, religion, science and art, in the same way that the stars are in the sky. If everything is there, if everything is perfectly collected and united in the interior of philosophy, where is its exterior space? Is it perhaps that the real world, the material world, does not exist for all philosophies? Berkeley, for example, was a bishop for whom, in Elaine's phrase, the meal was already cooked. Yet this bishop was a man like any other, and did not equivocate about the existence of roast beef, that is the existence of the external world. Cubed in what, then, does this malign process operative in philosophy consist? In the interests of precision, there is a small nuance which must detain us here. In order to make all social practices and ideas enter its domain, and in order to impose itself upon these social practices and ideas with the aim of speaking their truth for them, philosophy plays tricks. That is, when philosophy absorbs and re-elaborates them in accordance with its own philosophical form, it scarcely does it with scrupulous respect for the reality, the particular nature, of such social practices and ideas. On the contrary, in affirming its power of truth over them, philosophy compels them to undergo a veritable transformation, although this truth is usually imperceptible. What else can it do to adjust them to, and think them under, the unity of one and the same truth? Nor is it necessary to proceed very far to be convinced of this. The same impulse is evident in Descartes' vis avis Galileo's physics, which is without a doubt something more than experimentation. In Kant's little operation on chemistry and psychology. To say nothing of Plato's and Hegel's maneuvers with morality and politics or economics. When confronted with the objection that it has an exterior space, philosophy is right to protest and to respond that it does not, since it takes command of everything. In truth, philosophy's exterior space must be sought within philosophy itself, in this appropriation of extra-philosophical space to which social practices are subjected, in this operation of exploitation, and hence deformation, of social practices that permits philosophy to unify such practices under the truth. Philosophy's true exterior space, then, is within philosophy itself. In other words, this separation, this distance between the deformation and the actual practice, is the commitment to exist over and above such exploitation and transformation. It is resistance to philosophical violence. But the most important thing remains to be said. Because what has been said so far could be interpreted in terms of the will to power, accounting for the history of philosophy somewhat in Nietzsche's manner, at a given moment there existed men motivated by ressentiment who, wounded by the world, set about dominating it through thought, in short, making themselves the masters of the world, conceiving it exclusively through their own thought. The philosophers were precisely these specialists in the violence of the concept, of Begriff, of appropriation, who asserted their power by subjecting to the law of truth all the social practices of men, who became sadder and lived on in the night. We know that such a perspective is not foreign to some of our contemporaries who, naturally enough, discover in philosophy the archetype of power, the model of all power. They themselves write the equation knowledge equals power and, in the style of modern and cultivated anarchists, affirm, violence, tyranny, state despotism are Plato's fault, just as they used to say a while back that the revolution was Rousseau's fault. The best way to respond to them is to go further than they do and introduce the scandalous fracture of practice into the very heart of philosophy. This is where Marx's influence is perhaps most profoundly felt. Hitherto we have let it be believed that philosophy was content to introduce the totality of human practices and ideas into its thought, in order to enunciate truth with it. And we have provisionally assumed that if philosophy, having absorbed the totality of the social practices, deformed them, it was to a certain extent for logical and technical reasons, in order to be able to unify them. If we wish to add a certain number of objects to an already full suitcase, it is necessary to fold and deform them. If we wish to imagine the social practices under the unity of the good, a large number of deformations will be required in order to mold them into this unity. Engels said something similar somewhere, when he asserted that all philosophy was systematic as a function of the imperishable desire of the human mind to overcome all contradictions. Well, I do not think this is entirely correct. I think, rather, that these unifying or contradictory deformations uniquely concern the peculiar logic of philosophical discourse. I am perfectly well aware that in every philosopher, as in every mathematician who knows how to appreciate the elegance of a proof, there slumbers a lover of the arts, and there is no shortage of philosophers who have believed, with Kant, that the construction of a system was a question not only of logic, but of aesthetics as well. When logic does not suffice, or in order to make it digestible, a little aesthetics is thrown in, namely the beautiful and the good, which historically have had the habit of appearing in public together, so as to be noticed by polite society. But here we have to do with the foibles of philosophers, and one should not judge philosophy on the basis of them, just as mathematics should not be judged on the basis of the elegance of mathematicians. The truth is another thing. To reach it, not only must the psychology of philosophers be scorned, but also the illusion in which philosophy finds its repose, the illusion of its own power over the social practices. Because, and it is here that everything is decided, what is important is not that philosophy exercises power over social practices and ideas. What matters is that philosophy does not incorporate social practices under the unity of its thought in gratuitous fashion, but by removing the social practices from their own space, by subjecting this hierarchy to an internal order that constitutes its true unification. In other words, the world thought by philosophy is a unified world in so far as it is disarticulated and rearticulated, that is reordered, by philosophy. It is a world in which the different social practices, decomposed and recomposed, are distributed in a certain order of distinction and hierarchy which is significant. What makes it significant is not that philosophy dominates its objects but that it decomposes and recomposes them in a special order of internal hierarchy and distinction, an order which endows the whole operation of philosophy with significance. Of course, in order to realize this entire operation, in order to distribute its objects in this order, philosophy has to dominate them. Or, put another way, this necessity compels philosophy to take power over them. But let us always bear in mind that power never signifies power for power's sake, not even in the political arena. Quite the reverse, power is nothing other than what one does with it, that is, what it produces as a result. And if philosophy is that which sees the whole, it sees it only for the purposes of reordering it, that is, imposing a determinate order upon the diverse elements of the whole. I cannot enter into details here. Thousands of examples could easily be offered, but let me rely on one that is unequivocal: the respective place accorded by Descartes, Kant and Hegel to what they conceive of as morality and religion. Evidently, this place, which is never identical in the totality of each of these systems, has profound repercussions upon each of their doctrines. Or, to take another more abstract example, let us recall how the presence of a theory of knowledge in Descartes and Kant, and its absence in Spinoza and Hegel, attest to their different treatments of scientific practice and derive from the overall orientation of each of these doctrines. I cannot go more deeply into this type of clarification now, but I do want to attend to one consequence of what has just been said. When the hypothesis is advanced that philosophy makes use of social practices and ideas in order to impose upon them a specific meaning in the interior of its system, it is clear that philosophy first has to decompose, and subsequently recompose, such practices. That is, philosophy needs to dissect the social practices in a certain way so that it can retain only those elements which it considers the most significant for its enterprise, subsequently recomposing such practices on the basis of those elements. Hence, starting from the reality of scientific practice, each philosopher fashions an idea of science. Starting from the reality of ethical practice, an idea of morality, etc. This systematic deformation, let us be clear, I intend deformation in the strongest sense of the word, provoked by the system. I mean not a logical system, but a system of domination, imposing a significance, a truth, on the social practices, produces philosophical objects that resemble real objects, but are different from them. Only there is something more important still, namely, in order to cause the appearance of the truth it wishes to impose in the interior of social practices or ideas, and in order to maintain the whole in one single block, philosophy finds itself obliged to invent what I would call philosophical objects, without a real, empirical referent, for example, truth, oneness, totality, the cogito, the transcendental subject, and many other categories of the same kind that do not exist outside philosophy. Years ago I wrote, philosophy does not have an object in the sense that a science has an object. Or, although philosophy has no object, there exist philosophical objects. Philosophy has its objects within itself, and it works on them interminably. It modifies them, it takes them up again, it cannot do without them, because such philosophical objects, which are nothing more than the object of philosophy, are the means by which philosophy achieves its objectives, its mission, to impose upon the social practices and ideas that figure in its system the deformation imposed by the determinate order of that system. I was talking just now about the theory of knowledge, and I said that its presence in Descartes and Kant, like its absence in Spinoza and Hegel, has a meaning. The theory of knowledge is one of those objects of philosophy which does not belong to anything but philosophy, and vis-à-vis which philosophers can situate themselves. From the moment we encounter this object we are in the heart of what constitutes the peculiarity of philosophy, the objects that are its and its alone, and in which all the destiny of its activity is played out. If we pursue this course, we will be in a better position to understand how practice erupts to take philosophy from behind and to show that it has an exterior. Its exterior space, once again, is what takes place within it, not only logical deformations of the social practices in order to subject them to the non-contradictory formal unity of a systematic thought that encompasses the totality, but also dismemberment and reconstruction, the ordered rearrangement of these same deformed social practices, a double deformation, then, dictated by the exigencies of that ordering which ultimately dominates everything and imparts to philosophy its meaning. What might this meaning be? Because up to this point everything has taken place in written texts, in abstract discourses, that seem very distant from real social practices which only appear in philosophy in the form of categories and notions. Of course, this whole mental operation can satisfy its author with a beautiful conceptual unity, responding to his or her need for a search for truth. After all, collectors and chess players are numerous. But what can this little private conceptual matter have to do with history, once its procedures are unmasked, once one no longer believes that it has any vocation to speak the truth? In reality, this is where things get serious, and this we owe to Marx. What I am about to say is not entirely in Marx, of course, but without him we could not say it. No one will deny that, at least in certain areas, history knows perfectly well how to select and to recognize its own. And it is surely not fortuitous that this has consecrated the historical existence of philosophy. It is not by chance that philosophy survives, that these sacred abstract texts, interminably read and reread by generations of students, incessantly commented upon and glossed, can weather the storms and high seas of our cultural universe, to play their part in it. And since it is not the love of art that inspires their reading or fidelity to their history, if such texts survive, paradoxical as it may seem, it is because of the results they produce. And if they produce results, it is because these are required by the societies of our history. The whole question consists in knowing precisely what these results are and to what order they pertain. I want to warn the audience that what I am about to say cannot pretend to exhaust the subject. Like any other social and cultural reality, philosophy par excellence is overdetermined. But I wish to foreground what I consider to be its essential determination, its determination in the last instance. Because we have hitherto forgotten a fundamentally important reality. To wit, philosophy, which pretends to enunciate the truth of things once and for all, embodies this paradoxical characteristic of being, in its essence, conflictual, and perpetually so. Kant said of philosophy, the philosophy that preceded his own, that it was a battlefield. And all the philosophers who preceded and succeeded him have proved him right, since they have never written anything which did not make war upon one or another of their predecessors. Thus philosophy, and with an insistence and a constancy so striking as to reveal its nature, is a perpetual war of ideas. Why this war? It cannot be put down to neurasthenia in susceptible personalities. The innumerable sub-philosophers, rule-of-thumb philosophers, or tear-out-your-hair philosophers, as Marx used to say, who entered the war out of sheer contrariness, as failed authors spoiling for a fight, have left no traces in history. But on the other hand, all those who have remained in history have done nothing more than fight among themselves, and, as shrewd combatants, knew how to find support against their principal adversary in the arguments of their secondary adversaries, how to make allies, bestowing insults and praise. Adopting, in short, positions, and bellicose positions, without any ambiguity. It is on the basis of this general struggle that we must try to understand the results produced by the existence of historical philosophy. And this is where Marx's thought becomes decisive. In the preface to the 1859 contribution, Marx ventured the idea that a social formation rests upon its economic infrastructure, that is, on the unity of the productive forces and the relations of production. In the infrastructure is rooted the class struggle, which pits the owners of the means of production against the directly exploited workers. And Marx added that above this infrastructure there was erected a whole superstructure, comprising law and the state on the one hand, and the ideologies on the other. The superstructure does nothing more than reflect the infrastructure. Evidently, life must be breathed into this typography, which offers a shortcut in the history of a social formation, and it must be granted that if a social formation exists, in the strong sense, it is because it is capable, like every living being, of reproducing itself, but, unlike other living beings, of also reproducing its own conditions of existence. The material conditions of reproduction are secured by production itself, which also secures a considerable proportion of the conditions of reproduction of the relations of production. But the economic and political conditions of reproduction are secured by law and the state. As far as the ideologies are concerned, they participate in the relations of production and in the ensemble of social relations, securing the hegemony of the dominant class at the level of ideas or culture. Among these ideologies are, in general, to be found legal ideology, political ideology, ethical ideology, religious ideology, and what Marx calls philosophical ideology. With regard to these ideologies, Marx says that it is in them that men become conscious of their class conflict and fight it out. I leave to one side the question of whether Marx's term philosophical ideology exactly covers what has been designated here as philosophy. But I shall retain two essential pointers. First, what occurs within philosophy maintains an intimate relation with what occurs in the ideologies. Second, what occurs within the ideologies maintains a close relation with the class struggle. Up to now, and for simplicity's sake, I have spoken above all of the social practices, saying that philosophy proposed to state their truth, since it considered itself alone capable of so doing. But at the same time I have referred to social practices and ideas so as to highlight the fact that philosophy is not concerned solely with the production of a manufactured object. Equally, I have attempted to underline that neither is philosophy concerned exclusively with the practice of the production of knowledge, whether scientific or of some other type, as one observes in all our authors. And nor does it concern itself exclusively with juridical, ethical or political practice, nor any other practice tending to transform or to conserve something in the world. I have indicated all this because, while it is concerned with social practices, philosophy is also interested in the ideas that men form of these practices, ideas that in some cases will be used to condemn or criticize, in others to approve, but which in the final analysis are useful for proposing a new interpretation, a new truth. This is because, in reality, the social practices and the ideas men form of them are intimately linked. It can be said that there is no practice without ideology, and that every practice, including scientific practice, realizes itself through an ideology. In all the social practices, whether they pertain to the domain of economic production, of science, of art or law, of ethics or of politics. The people who act are subjected to corresponding ideologies, independently of their will and usually in total ignorance of the fact. Having reached this point, I think I can advance the idea that philosophy satisfies itself only by acting upon the contradictory set of existing ideologies, acting upon the background of class struggle and its historical agency. Such action is by no means nugatory. No Marxist can defend the idea that the action exercised upon the practices by ideology suffices to change their nature and general orientation. This because it is not ideology which is determinant in the last instance. Nevertheless, the efficacy of ideology is far from negligible. On the contrary, it can be quite considerable and, in keeping with real historical experiences, Marx therefore acknowledged its highly significant role in the reproduction and transformation of social relations. Ideology's potential effectivity upon the social practices can be formally conceived as that of conferring a certain unity and direction upon them at a given stage of the class struggle. If the set of ideologies is capable of such action, and if the peculiarity of philosophy consists in acting upon the ideologies and, through them, upon the ensemble of social practices and their orientation, then the raison d'etre and scope of philosophy can be better appreciated. But I want to insist upon this point: its raison d'etre is comprehensible only in formal terms, because as yet we have not understood why it is imperative for the set of ideologies to receive from philosophy, under the categories of truth, this unity and its direction. In order to understand this, it is necessary, in Marx's perspective, to introduce what I would call the political form of the existence of ideologies in the ensemble of social practices. It is necessary to foreground class struggle and the concept of the dominant ideology. If the society in question is a class society, political power, the power of the state, will be held by the exploiting class. To preserve its power, and this we knew long before Marx, ever since Machiavelli inaugurated political theory, the dominant class must transform its power from one based upon violence to one based upon consent. By means of the free and habitual consent of its subjects, such a dominant class needs to elicit an obedience that could not be maintained by force alone. This is the purpose served by the ever-contradictory system of ideologies. This is what, following Gramsci, I have called the system of the ideological state apparatuses, to the first by which is meant the set of ideological, religious, moral, familial, legal, political, aesthetic, etc., institutions via which the class in power, at the same time as unifying itself, succeeds in imposing its particular ideology upon the exploited masses, as their own ideology. Once this occurs, the mass of the people, steeped in the truth of the ideology of the dominant class, endorses its values, thus giving its consent to the existing order, and the requisite violence can either be dispensed with or utilized as a last resort. However, this state of affairs, which, other than in exceptional periods, has been achieved only tendentially, presupposes, contrary to what is believed, something that is not so evident, namely, the existence of a dominant ideology. As Marx said, the dominant ideology is the ideology of the dominant class. This is bound to be the outcome of a struggle, but an extraordinarily complicated struggle. And historical experience shows that it takes time, sometimes a good deal of it, for a dominant class that has seized power to succeed in forging an ideology which finally becomes dominant. Take the bourgeoisie, it needed no fewer than 5 centuries, from the 14th century to the 19th, to achieve this. And even in the 19th century, when it had to confront the first struggles of the proletariat, it was still fighting against the ideology of the landed aristocracy, the heir of feudalism. From this digression we should retain the notion that the constitution of a dominant ideology is, for the dominant class, a matter of class struggle. In the case of the 19th century bourgeoisie, a matter of class struggle on 2 fronts. Now, this is not all. It is not simply a question of manufacturing a dominant ideology because you have need of one, by decree. Nor simply of constituting it in a long history of class struggle. It must be constructed at the basis of what already exists, starting from the elements, the regions, of existing ideology, from the legacy of the past, which is diverse and contradictory, and also through the unexpected events that constantly occur in science as well as politics. An ideology must be constituted, in the class struggle and its contradictions, on the basis of the contradictory ideological elements inherited from the past, which transcends all those contradictions, an ideology unified around the essential interests of the dominant class in order to secure what Gramsci called its hegemony. If we understand the reality of the dominant ideology in this way, we can, at least, this is the hypothesis I wish to advance, grasp the function peculiar to philosophy. Philosophy is neither a gratuitous operation nor a speculative activity. Pure, unsullied speculation indulges its self-conception. But the great philosophers already had a very different consciousness of their mission. They knew that they were responding to the great practical political questions. How could they orientate themselves in thought and in politics? What was to be done? What direction should they take? They even knew that these political questions were historical questions. That is, although they lived them as eternal questions, they knew that these questions were posed by the vital interests of the society for which they were thinking. But they certainly did not know what Marx enables us to understand and which I should like to convey in a few words. Indeed, it seems to me that one cannot understand the task, determinant in the last instance, of philosophy except in relation to the exigencies of the class struggle in ideology, in other words, the central question of hegemony, of the constitution of the dominant ideology. What we have seen occurring in philosophy, that reorganization and ordered positioning of social practices and ideas within a systematic unity under its truth, all this, which apparently transpires very far from the real, in philosophical abstraction, we can of course see being produced in a comparable, almost superimposed, but not simultaneous, form in the ideological class struggle. In both cases it is a question of reorganizing, dismembering, recomposing and unifying, according to a precise orientation, a whole series of social practices and their corresponding ideologies, in order to make sovereign, over all the subordinate elements, a particular truth that imposes on them a particular orientation, guaranteeing this orientation with that truth. If the correspondence is exact, we may infer that philosophy, which continues the class struggle as befits it, in theory, responds to a fundamental political necessity. The task which it is assigned and delegated by the class struggle in general, and more directly by the ideological class struggle, is that of contributing to the unification of the ideologies within a dominant ideology and of guaranteeing this dominant ideology as truth. How does it contribute? Precisely by proposing to think the theoretical conditions of possibility of reducing existing contradictions, and therefore of unifying the social practices and their ideology. This involves an abstract labor, a labor of pure thought, of pure end, hence, a priori theorization. And its result is to think, under the unity and guarantee of an identical orientation, the diversity of the different practices and their ideologies. In responding to this exigency, which it lives as an internal necessity but which derives from the major class conflicts and historical events, what does philosophy do? It produces a whole apparatus of categories which serve to think and position the different social practices in a determinate location under the ideologies, that is, in the place they must necessarily occupy in order to play the role expected of them in the constitution of the dominant ideology. Philosophy produces a general problematic, that is, a manner of posing, and hence resolving, the problems which may arise. In short, philosophy produces theoretical schemas, theoretical figures that serve as mediators for surmounting contradictions and as links for reconnecting the different elements of ideology. Moreover, it guarantees, by dominating the social practices thus reordered, the truth of this order, enunciated in the form of the guarantee of a rational discourse. I believe, then, that philosophy can be represented in the following manner. It is not outside the world, outside historical conflicts and events. In its concentrated, most abstract form, that of the works of the great philosophers, it is something that is on the side of the ideologies, a kind of theoretical laboratory in which the fundamentally political problem of ideological hegemony, that is of the constitution of the dominant ideology, is experimentally perfected in the abstract. Therein are perfected the theoretical categories and techniques that will make ideological unification, an essential aspect of ideological hegemony, possible. Because the work accomplished by the most abstract philosophers does not remain a dead letter, what philosophy has received as a necessity from the class struggle it returns in the form of thoughts that are going to work on the ideologies in order to transform and unify them. Just as the conditions of existence imposed on philosophy can be empirically observed in history, so philosophy's effects on the ideologies and the social practices can be observed. It suffices to think of 17th-century rationalism and Enlightenment philosophy, to take two well-known examples. The results of the work of philosophical elaboration are given in ideology and in the social practices. These two phases of bourgeois philosophy are two of the constitutive moments of bourgeois ideology as a dominant ideology. This constitution was accomplished in struggle, and in this struggle philosophy played its role as a theoretical foundation for the unity of this ideology. If everything that has just been said can be granted, and, above all, if it has been possible to say it because of Marx's discovery of the nature of class society, of the role of the state and of the ideologies in the superstructure, the question of Marxist philosophy becomes even more paradoxical. Because if, in the last instance, philosophy plays the role of laboratory for the theoretical unification and foundation of the dominant ideology, what is the role of philosophers who refuse to serve the dominant ideology? What is the role of a man like Marx, who declares in the postface to the second German edition that capital is a critique, that represents a class whose historical task is the overthrow of the capitalist mode of production and the final abolition of all classes. To the first put another way, if what I have proposed is plausible, how is a Marxist philosophy conceivable? In order to grasp its possibility, it is sufficient to reflect on the fact that the expression dominant ideology has no meaning if it is not set against another expression, the dominated ideology. And this derives from the very question of ideological hegemony. The fact that, in a society divided into classes, the dominant class must forge an ideology that is dominant, in order to unify itself and to impose it in turn on the dominated classes, issues in a process that unfolds with a good deal of resistance. Particularly because, in addition to the ideology of the old dominant class, which still survives, there exist in class society what Lenin called elements of another distinct ideology, that of the exploited class. The ideology of the dominant class does not constitute itself as dominant except over and against the ideological elements of the dominated class. A similar opposition can be found within philosophy itself, as one element of the hegemonic problem that philosophy is a war of all against all, that perpetual war which is the effect and the echo of the class struggle in philosophy. Thus the antagonistic positions of the antagonistic ideologies are represented within philosophy itself. Philosophy, which works in its own theoretical laboratory to the benefit of the ideological hegemony of the ascendant or dominant class, without realizing it, confronts its own adversaries, generally under the name of materialism. In principle, there occurs in philosophy something analogous to what takes place in class society, in the same way that the unity and the struggle of the exploited class are organized under class domination. The forms of philosophical partisanship for the dominated class are represented in the forms that constitute philosophy as philosophy, and hence under the forms of the question of ideological hegemony. Thus it is that the entire history of philosophy resounds deafeningly with the echo of the exploited or the opponents. Some, such as the 18th century materialists, went so far as to oppose their own system of truth to the representatives of the dominant class. But rather than the 18th century materialists, who did not represent the exploited class, but a new class of exploiters, the bourgeoisie then attempting to achieve an alliance with the aristocracy on the English model, perhaps those who ought to interest us are the ones who only half succeeded, or hardly succeeded, in imparting to their opposition the form of a philosophy produced as philosophy. For my part, one would closely investigate the cases of Epicurus and Machiavelli, to cite only them. But if I do so, it is only to try to understand Marx, that is, his silence. Basically, the whole paradox of Marx lies here. He who had received a philosophical formation refused to write philosophy. He who almost never spoke about philosophy, but had shaken the foundations of all traditional philosophy when he wrote the word practice in the thesis on Feuerbach, nonetheless, in writing Capital, practiced the philosophy he never wrote. And in writing Capital, Marx has left us, as no one before him had, the keys to beginning to understand what is at stake within philosophy itself, that is, to being able to begin to elaborate something like a theory of philosophy. After him, both Engels and Lenin wrote nothing but critiques and isolated fragments. So again, how are we to understand this paradox? Can it be understood on the basis of what has been proposed here? I shall attempt to set out what I believe in this regard, without concealing the fact that I am taking the risk of stating a very daring hypothesis. But I believe it is worth running the risk. When we observe the history of the Marxist workers' movement through the prism of the philosophical forms in which it has recognized itself, we encounter two typical situations. In the first we find ourselves with Marx, Engels, Lenin, Gramsci and Mao, who, in one way or another, always give the impression of distrusting like the plague anything that might appear to be a philosophy produced as such, as philosophy, in the forms of ideological hegemony we have analyzed. By contrast, we find ourselves in the second situation with people like Lukács, although he is not decisive, and above all with Stalin, who was indeed decisive in opening the highway for a Marxist philosophy produced as philosophy. Stalin did this by re-inflecting some unfortunate sentences of Engels's regarding matter and motion, etc., and by orientating Marxist philosophy towards a materialist ontology or metaphysics in which philosophical theses are realized through matter. To the first squared it is clear that Stalin did not possess the great circumspection of Marx, Lenin and Gramsci, and that his philosophical positions originated in his political line and terrorist practices, since it is not difficult to show that Stalinist philosophical positions are not only not foreign to the political line of Stalinism, but that they were even perfectly serviceable for it. Nor would it be difficult to show how, within the profound Stalinist crisis from which we are scarcely now beginning to recover, Stalin's philosophical positions started Marxist philosophy on its way. Thus it is as if the history of the Marxist workers' movement, at a point that is still obscure, had experimentally vindicated Marx, Lenin and Gramsci, contradicting Plekhanov, Bogdanov, and especially Stalin. It is as if, owing to the extreme haziness, yet great discretion, of their directly philosophical interventions, together with their constant practice of a philosophy that they never wanted to write, Marx, Lenin and Gramsci had suggested that the philosophy required by Marxism was by no means a philosophy produced as philosophy, but rather a new practice of philosophy. In order to understand what lies at the root of this, we may start from Marx's contrast, in the postface to the second German edition of Capital, between two conceptions of the dialectic. In the first conception, the dialectic serves, and I quote, to glorify the existing order of things. Hence it involves an apologia for the dominant class. In the second, the dialectic is critical and revolutionary. To the first cubed it is this latter conception alone which is capable of serving the proletariat. To simplify, one could say that it is correct to think that Stalin regressed to the first conception and that, in order to avoid this peril, Marx steadfastly held to the second and never wrote philosophy as philosophy. Marx manifestly considered that to produce philosophy as philosophy was a way of entering into the adversary's game. That even in an oppositional form it meant playing by the rules of hegemony and contributing, indirectly, to a confrontation with bourgeois ideology which accepts the validity of its form of philosophical expression. That to dress up proletarian ideology in forms demanded by the question of bourgeois ideological hegemony was to compromise the future, and thus the present, of proletarian ideology. And finally, that it was to risk succumbing, within philosophy, to the party of the state. Because the history of the relations between philosophy and the state is, as the philosopher Paul Nizan likewise saw, to the first, a long history. I referred to this when I alluded to the question of the dominant ideology. The dominant ideology is the ideology of the dominant class, therefore of the class which holds state power. From Plato to Descartes, Spinoza, Kant, Hegel and even Husserl, philosophy is obsessed by the question of the state, generally in the form of a nostalgic call by the philosopher to the state that it might see fit to listen to him, when it is not in the form of a dream of the philosopher as head of state. By contrast, with a very sheer political instinct, Marx clearly understood the political and philosophical significance of the question of the state. He not only thought about the existing bourgeois state, of which Dietzgen, with Lenin's approval, said, in words famous for their severity, that philosophy professors were its flunkies. To the first, he not only thought about the bourgeois state, the first ideological power, in Engels's words, capable of imposing the form of its ideology on all philosophical production. Marx saw much further. He thought about the form of the future state, the one which it would be necessary to construct after the revolution, of which the experience of the Commune had given him a first idea and which had to be, not a state but a community or, as Engels put it, no longer a state in the proper sense of the word. To the first, in short, a totally new form that would induce its own disappearance, its own extinction. Naturally, this strategic viewpoint of Marx's, which entirely subverted the conventional conception of the state, which is still in evidence today, was no chimera, but rested upon one of his profound convictions, that the proletariat, as it had been produced and concentrated by the capitalist mode of production, as it was educated by its great class struggles, possessed capacities that were totally foreign to the bourgeois world, above all, the ability to invent mass-based forms of organization, such as the Paris Commune and the Soviets of 1905 and 1917, which are a good example of forms of organization that enable the proletariat to exist at the margin of the state. Of course, Marx's strategic vision, which foresaw the destruction of the state, encompassed the whole superstructure, including the ideologies, and thus the dominant ideology, quite inseparable from the state. It is quite possible that Marx always had the same distrust of philosophy and the state, for the reasons that connect traditional philosophy with the state and caused him to foresee the abolition of the state. In no way did this involve an anarchist rejection of the state, despite certain affinities between Marx and the anarchists. Nor, by the same token, did it involve a rejection of philosophy. On the contrary, it involved a profound mistrust of an institution, the state, and a form of unification of the dominant ideology, philosophy, which appeared to Marx to be profoundly linked, insofar as both are involved in the same mechanism of bourgeois class domination. For my part, I believe that this is why Marx abstained from all philosophy produced as philosophy in order not to fall into the glorification of the existing order of things. If this is true, Marx has bequeathed Marxists, cruelly instructed by the counter-experience of Stalinist ontology, an especially difficult undertaking. Just as he left the workers' movement with the task of inventing new forms of commune that would convert the state into something superfluous, so Marx left Marxist philosophers with the task of inventing new forms of philosophical intervention to hasten the end of bourgeois ideological hegemony. In sum, the task of inventing a new practice of philosophy. To support our argument by comparison with the revolutionary state, which ought to be a state that is a non-state that is, a state tending to its own dissolution, to be replaced by forms of free association. One might equally say that the philosophy which obsessed Marx, Lenin and Gramsci ought to be a non-philosophy, that is, one which ceases to be produced in the form of a philosophy, whose function of theoretical hegemony will disappear in order to make way for new forms of philosophical existence. And just as the free association of workers ought, according to Marx, to replace the state so as to play a totally different role from that of the state, not one of violence and repression, so it can be said that the new forms of philosophical existence linked to the future of these free associations will cease to have as their essential function the constitution of the dominant ideology, with all the compromises and exploitation that accompany it, in order to promote the liberation and free exercise of social practices and human ideas. And as with the perspectives on the state, the task assigned Marxist philosophy is not one for the distant future. It is an undertaking for the present, for which Marxists ought to be prepared. Marx was the first to show us the way by putting philosophy into practice in a new and disconcerting form, refusing to produce a philosophy as philosophy but practicing it in his political, critical and scientific work, in short, inaugurating a new, critical and revolutionary relation between philosophy and the social practices, which are at one and the same time the stakes and the privilege side of class struggle. This new practice of philosophy serves the proletarian class struggle without imposing upon it an oppressive ideological unity. We know where that oppression has its roots, but rather creating for it the ideological conditions for the liberation and free development of social practices. La Transformación de la Filosofía, Universidad de Granada, Granada 1976. Translated by Thomas E. Lewis. 7. Marxism today. Can we, 130 years after the Communist Manifesto and 110 years after Capital, outline something like a balance sheet of what is called Marxism? Certainly, for we have not only a historical perspective on Marxism but the long experience of its victories, defeats and tragedies. Perhaps too, because we are henceforth living within a crisis, within its crisis, a situation conducive to dispelling all illusions and concentrating minds on the pitiless test of reality. Today, then, what can we retain of Marx that is essential, and has possibly not always been understood? There is, first of all, one simple fact. Marx said that he was not a Marxist. To the first, this remark, which has been taken as the quip of a free spirit who required readers to think for themselves, squared, actually carries great weight. Marx was not only protesting in advance against the interpretation of his work as a system, as a new philosophy of history, or as the finally discovered science of political economy, and over with the unity of a total theory, Marxism produced by an author, Marx. Marx was not only rejecting this pretension in declaring Capital not science but critique of political economy, but in so doing he was changing the very meaning of the term criticism or critique. Upon this notion, charged with delivering the true from the false, or denouncing the false in the name of the true, by the rationalist tradition, Marx was imposing an entirely different mission, founded on the class struggle. Such a critique represents one class, the proletariat. And with these words, he rejected the idea that he might, in the traditional sense, be the intellectual author of such a critique. These reflections return us to another fact. It was within the working class movement, by participating in its practice, its hopes, and its struggles, that the thought of Marx and Engels changed fundamentally. became critical and revolutionary? This is not just a simple point in the history of ideas. In the history of Marxism, it has become the stake of crucially significant theory.